Welcome to Beyond the Red Carpet. I'm Francine Brokaw. Today I have a very special guest. Let me introduce Rick Allen. Welcome, Rick.
Great to be with you.
So strange doing this across the country. You're over on the East Coast and I'm here in California. We've known each other since the mid-'80s and go back quite a way. But what I wanted to have you on today to talk about was Robert Kennedy. We have two books. We'll get into that in a minute. But let me ask you, 52 years ago, he was killed. You and I never met the man.
Right.
You were young when he was assassinated. What do you think it was about him that resonated in us as young kids that pushed us to do in the directions of our lives that we went in, thanks to Robert Kennedy? What did he have?
Well, I think a number of things. It was an extraordinarily vibrant time. It had a huge impact on anybody who went through it of any age. I think we as young people, it had particularly large impact because the Kennedys were the first heroes for many people of our generation. But I think the third aspect of it is entirely based on the uniqueness of the man, the strength of the message, the resonance of it over the course of years, where the perspectives that he enunciated, the call to leadership that he exercised, is as vibrant today as it was then. And in many cases, our country has slipped from our ideals in the intervening years. And so we feel the lack of that leadership as much as we ever have. And it makes sense for us to look for examples of others who, in times that were even more violent and certainly as polarized, had a path forward for us as individuals and as a nation.
Well, I did my college thesis on his last campaign. And in high school, I did a term paper about his speeches, because the speeches are great. You can have a great speech and not a great delivery, and vice versa. But he managed to just grasp everything that we were thinking and that we wanted from life. And that brings us to 1993?
It was 93 that the first edition came out, yes.
We wrote, well, I worked with you on RFK collected speeches.
Yes.
And then that was amazing because it was in one place we got to put all his amazing words together. And then 2 years ago, you added to it with RFK, his words for our times.
Yes.
Now, it's a little different because you do have some intros in there. But I think besides, obviously, everybody remembers him after Martin Luther King. But one of the things that I remember, having studied him a lot like you have, was the 1964 Democratic Convention.
Yes.
Who today would quote Shakespeare? It's mind-boggling. He quoted Aeschylus, he quoted Shakespeare, poets, authors, everything. And today people would be laughed off the stage where they quote Shakespeare. This man had something in him.
Well, he was exceptionally well-read, and he really integrated into his own being words from others that he found meaningful. I think the expectations of political rhetoric have changed in the intervening time as well, and that's a substantial part of it. I was in the Clinton administration and had the chance to work with President Clinton on the AmeriCorps program, but to write speeches for him and work with him on his public remarks. And he had a different approach to rhetoric. He was equally eloquent, I believe, but he felt that the American ear had changed, and what worked with an audience was a little bit more plain spoken. Robert Kennedy believed really strongly that you always sought an audience at the highest possible level. You didn't seek to diminish the power of your rhetoric, the examples that you were quoting or pointing to. You provided them as you would to any audience of any age in any place at any time. And I think that that communicated exceptionally well for him because it was clearly authentic. You mentioned the remarks on the death of Martin Luther King. Those were extemporaneous entirely. And the story behind the circumstances that evening are laid out in the book. And you can see that the eloquence which he so admirably presented in a formal fixed speech was something that he could do under horrible circumstances extemporaneously.
Yeah, that was amazing to see the aftermath of his words that horrific night. I don't want to ask you how old you were in 1968, but
I was 14.
14. Okay, so we're about the same age, just when you're off. But for some reason, even at that young age, I took notice of him, whereas a lot of my friends were going for Eugene McCarthy. But I said, no, Robert Kennedy is the one, and he impacted me throughout all these years. But I do want to stress that the times have changed. The Robert Kennedy of 1968 would not have been the Robert Kennedy of 2020. Things have just changed, and I get a little frustrated when people look at Ted Kennedy, when that's all they know of Kennedys because they're in this latest generation, and they think that's what the Kennedy name was. There were two different men, two different, completely different people, and different times that shaped them. Can you speak a little bit about how Robert Kennedy, were he not to have been shot that night and gone on to the Chicago Convention and won, what do you think his main goals would have been during the first 1,000 days of his presidency versus that of his older brother John?
Well, I think he laid them out very eloquently in his announcement for the presidency in March of 1968. And then as you follow the speeches through the campaign, you see the central themes. First was to end the war in Vietnam, which was horrible for all countries involved and for the citizens of both Vietnam and the United States. And it took America away from its leadership in the world and from the necessary projects at home. And that second set of issues, the domestic issues, were a key focus of the campaign again from the beginning. And the objectives were to heal and unite an extremely divided nation, particularly to give voice to the voiceless, which for him encapsulated many, many communities in America, from rural farmers, predominantly white, to steel workers, ethnics of various backgrounds, to African American students, to farm workers in the fields of California, to Native Americans on reservations throughout the country. All of those people were not being provided a meaningful opportunity to participate in the American dream, to advance their own values for their own families and communities, but to participate in the greater project of remaking America. And that was a central theme for the 1968 campaign as well. And so I think had he succeeded, been nominated, been elected, those would have been the areas that he drove towards. But he was constantly trying to challenge America to see its potential for greatness, not in kind of easy bumper stickers, but in the hard work of really making change. He was impatient. That was a characteristic from his early youth throughout his life. He drove people around him exceptionally hard, and he had the ability to attract, as his brother had, both brothers did, attract people of extraordinary capabilities to work with him on these projects, to expect the most out of them and out of himself and out of the country.
Okay, now you know several of the members of the family. I was friends with Chris Lawford, Robert Kennedy's nephew, and we were talking one day and said, we were talking about how the family the younger generation went to drugs and possibly could have been as a reaction to all the tragedy. But he said, had Robert Kennedy lived, president or not, there's no way he would have stood for that with these younger Kennedys. He was that strong within his family, whereas his brother didn't have that. So there's something in Robert Kennedy that knew right from wrong. And can you, have you heard that before?
Well, it's, I mean, obviously I have to defer to Chris for his perspective on his broader family. I would say a couple of things about that. Robert Kennedy had a very large immediate family. He had 11, he and Ethel Kennedy had 11.
Large, past 1,000.
And so he was the actual father of a huge percentage of the next generation of Kennedy kids. His role was different because of that. His role in becoming the patriarch for the family, because of his older brother John's death and his father Joseph Kennedy's stroke and then death, Robert Kennedy in the years from 63 to 68 was holding together multiple generations of a family who were constantly the topic of news coverage for things good and trivial. After the tragedy of his death and the other tragedies that have occurred in the family down through the years, it's exceptionally hard for any of us who are not members of that family to, I think, fully appreciate the extraordinary pressures that every generation with that name has had to rise to. I have had the privilege of being close to most of the children, knowing them all and close to many, and have now gotten to know the grandkids, quite a number of them, very well. They are individually and collectively absolutely extraordinary. And I'm proud to consider them as friends, and I have boundless respect for them because of what they've accomplished in an absolute sense, but also their ability, which is unique in my experience, to come together as a family in times of horrible tragedy and find meaning through their faith and through their commitment to one another, to carry on and to continue to believe that they have a responsibility to serve the globe, serve their fellow country people in some manner and in some way that works with their individual talents. So would it have been easier on all of the family members if these horrible tragedies had not occurred? Without question. Would Robert Kennedy, who was someone of a fierce moral compass, exercised a strong role in the extended family, should he have lived? If he had lived, absolutely. But again, I want to give credit to the succeeding generations because I really think that it's a family whose service has been exceptional.
Okay, going back to our main topic of Robert Kennedy and his speeches. In 1964, when he ran for Senate, he was not really what you would call the best candidate. As a campaigner, let's say, like he was not the best campaigner. Yet in 68, when he ran for presidency, he was a phenomenal campaigner. Do you think he was really excited more to be president than he was for to join the Senate? Or do you think that was just probably a byproduct of his losing his best friend and his brother?
I think there were a number of things operating there. As you said, his grief was all-encompassing after the death of President Kennedy. And he had to rouse himself out of that to even make the decision to run for the Senate. And I think he felt exceptionally divided in doing so through much of that campaign. He was very, very comfortable campaigning on behalf of his brother. That was a natural gear for him. He wasn't someone who very much enjoyed public speaking, I don't think at any point in his life. He was much more comfortable being behind the scenes, being the campaign manager as he had been for his brother in the Senate and in the presidential campaign, being an advisor, being a leader at the Department of Justice as Attorney General. I think to ask people for support for him personally as a candidate was very tough for him. And every time he spoke in public and he received enormous emotional support from crowds, he understood that that was largely for his brother. And that's a difficult thing to process as a candidate. I think by the time you got to 1968, he had been around the world multiple times. He had spoken in every imaginable circumstance on almost every possible issue. He had written extensively, he had read extensively, he had participated in intensive investigations and dialogues, grilling witnesses in the Senate. And when he went out on the trail, he had made a very difficult decision that he did want to run for president, that he did believe it was essential for him to try to speak to these issues in that context. And being highly competitive, he went to win. And he had gotten comfortable with the notion that he was the vessel for change. He personally, as a candidate, was important to try to capture the moment and move the country. And he did so against many of his own instincts, which weren't oriented in that direction.
Yes. Well, in these two books, there are a lot of speeches. And actually, his speeches made me want to be a speechwriter because I could listen to, I had audios of them when I was younger, and I would listen to them over and over and over again. Do you have a favorite quote or a favorite speech that he gave? It's hard to find, but there's so many. I mean, it's all so good.
Yeah, I've been asked that a lot, and it is difficult for me to give a single answer. It's a little bit of the parents' pride for all their children. I will answer that. I want to describe the book for your audience just really briefly. There are really three aspects to it, and the center of the book, of course, is the presentation of speeches and writings throughout his life, starting in his early 20s in the British Mandate of Palestine, just before the State of Israel was formed, writing bylined articles for the Boston newspaper about what he sees in that cauldron in the Middle East, and continuing through the speech he gave in the night he was killed. That is the bulk of the book. We weave around it Ed Guthman, my mentor, the late Ed Guthman,
Pulitzer
and
Prize.
Pulitzer Prize winner, Robert Kennedy's communications head in the Justice Department, senior figure running his 64 campaign, one of the most honored journalists in America. What we did in both books is weave the narrative of Robert Kennedy's life and times around the presentations of the speeches and writings themselves, so that the reader has the context for what he was going through, what the country and the world were going through. And then, as you said, we have an introductory beginning of the book where we have very brief essays from extremely individualistic perspectives from extraordinary people around the world of how they regarded Robert Kennedy's legacy to themselves as individuals, to their countries, and to the course of issues. So President Obama, President Clinton, Desmond Tutu, Bono, a wide range of individuals.
You didn't ask me. Oh well.
That was a shortcoming, I'll admit. But that is the wonderful way we think to for individuals who didn't have the chance to know Robert Kennedy at all, even as young people as we were. More than half of Americans today were born after his death. And really, in large part, particularly the second edition, is framed up for that generation because you and I and others find his voice, his policies so important and relevant for our country today that we wanted to provide that in a way that would be easy to access for folks who've grown up subsequently.
Do you have this on CD or audio version?
There's an audio version, there's a large format type version, there's a soft cover, there's a hard cover. It's on Amazon and available through most bookstores around the country. And the audio version is really terrific. We had two extraordinary actors, one to voice the context setting before the excerpts, and the second to read Robert Kennedy's words. And they're all available on Amazon.
Didn't you get the actual the one that I work with you on? Didn't you use the actual Robert Kennedy?
We did. We had the actual speech tapes, and then Martin Sheen voiced the narration.
Right.
What our publishers this second time around, HarperCollins, had determined was that they wanted to do the entire book available in an audio version. What we had done in '93 was a small percentage of it based on where we had actual speech tapes to be able to utilize. Since most of the speeches don't exist in audio form, and following the direction of the folks at Morrow and HarperCollins, we went with a full audio version, every word in the book itself, and that led us to use the two talented actors I referenced.
Well, I highly recommend people listen to it versus just reading it and then listening, because you have to hear the words. There's something, you have to hear them. And you may disagree with me on this, but I think the assassination of Robert Kennedy was more impactful to this country than that of John Kennedy. It was harder to take.
I think, this was an accumulative series of horrible blows to the nation. And John Kennedy, and then Martin Luther King, and then Robert Kennedy represented the death of heroes for multiple generations and really across the globe. And the question that I think we were all confronted with is, with our heroes gone, what's our role now? what do we step up to or do we step back from? And I think that's been the central challenge for our generation. But as we look at current times, I think it's crystal clear that whether Robert Kennedy is your hero or not, our times demand leadership and require out of each of us as individuals and community members to rise to the challenge of our times. I believe, and I feel strongly that you do as well, that Robert Kennedy shows us a path towards healing a divided nation, towards focusing resources where they're most needed, and towards reclaiming the reality of America that we're constantly chasing and never reaching. And so there, it's a call to action, and it's an opportunity to start to examine how someone else with extraordinary access and talents framed up those very same issues in his time and offered us guideposts.
Well, I have never found anybody else that has affected me in such a deep way. And I'm sure that's the same with you. One quick question before you go. Somebody asked me to ask this of you. I did have a guest on my show once that was in the kitchen the night of the assassination. And he brought up the fact that Bobby Jr. is exploring reopening the case. Have you spoken with family members about that?
I have from time to time, and I know and admire Paul Schrade, who was shot that evening and who has been very involved in the reopening of the investigation. I think it's up to law enforcement and the judicial system on the one hand, people like Paul who were victims and have every right to call for whatever investigation they feel would illuminate things, and to the family who obviously has a principal interest here in determining what they believe would be useful. I've always focused on Robert Kennedy's life and not his death. And so I haven't been involved in those efforts, not because I don't think they're worthy, not because I feel there are no questions about the circumstances, there obviously are, but because I'm a single individual with limited talents and limited time, and I'd rather apply them to taking the lessons of his life forward into our own circumstances.
Very well said. Very well said. That's really great. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today. And one of the days when you are in California, maybe we'll get you in person.
I'd love that.
Okay, we'll stay in touch. And the rest of you viewers, I will see you next time when we take another look beyond the red carpet.